On May 18, 2005, a large crowd of excited people eagerly lined up in front of a bustling stage, anxiously awaiting the revelation of a brand new game. The anticipation was intense, given that the previous iteration of this game had been a critical and commercial success, winning Game of the Year and being hailed as one of the best video games ever made. The game in question is none other than Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, Bethesda's most ambitious game to date, and the sequel to the now classic Elder Scrolls III: Morrowind.
How about a brand new, full-featured, next-generation role-playing game in the launch window? Morrowind was one of the best-selling role-playing games ever on the Xbox. The sequel to this incredible game is called Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. It promises to feature one of the largest open-ended worlds ever created for a video game.
However, there was a catch. This new game was initially exclusive to PC and Xbox, leaving other consoles like the PlayStation 3 out of the picture. In Japan, Sony executives were concerned and trying to figure out how to capitalize on the rising popularity of RPGs, driven by the upcoming Oblivion game. Their attention turned to an obscure company named From Software, known for creating several first-person role-playing games under the King's Field series, bearing some resemblance to the Elder Scrolls games. Creating a clone for the PlayStation 3 should be relatively easy, right? This is the story of the making of Demon's Souls, and how it brought forth the creative genius of Hidetaka Miyazaki in the dark fantasy genre for the first time. Join me as we explore its creation and uncover the fascinating journey behind Miyazaki's first masterpiece. In 2005, at the age of 31, Hidetaka Miyazaki was immersed in his second project as a game director, the mecha game Armored Core for Answer. However, for the moment, we shall set aside his journey and delve into the context and environment in which the game Demon's Souls was born, gaining a deeper understanding of its inception. To do so, let us examine the timeline of the game industry during this period. In this timeline, one crucial year stands out as having a significant impact on the inception of Demon's Souls, the year 2005. It marked the official start of the next generation of console wars, as new devices were unveiled during E3 2005. Three major players emerged, each vying for dominance in this era: Microsoft's Xbox 360, Sony's PlayStation 3, and Nintendo's Wii. The competition was intense and dynamic, as each company pursued its distinct approach and strategies. Each new console introduced breakthrough technology. For instance, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 offered high-definition graphics, while the Wii focused on integrating controllers with movement sensors instead of traditional joysticks, appealing to non-traditional gamers. A significant area of competition among these consoles was the availability of games in their libraries. Each major gaming console developer sought to secure exclusive game titles only available on their platform. This exclusivity often influenced gamers' purchasing decisions and fostered brand loyalty. Given this, it was expected that Sony would prepare a countermove when Bethesda unveiled the Xbox-exclusive new entry in the Elder Scrolls franchise, Oblivion. While it was a timed exclusive, it significantly boosted the sales of the new Xbox 360, especially since it hit the market a year ahead of Sony's PlayStation 3 and Nintendo's Wii. The previous entry in the series, Morrowind, had been a critical and commercial success, earning various awards, including Game of the Year, and securing a spot among the greatest games ever created. Sony, well aware of the power of console exclusives, wouldn't simply sit idly by without creating a counter to Oblivion. Consequently, they approached an obscure Japanese game developer named From Software for a possible collaboration to create a new title that could rival Elder Scrolls Oblivion. In various interviews, Miyazaki himself confirmed the intent of Sony in wanting to partner with From Software. He said, "Yes, at the time, the Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion was truly a big deal, and I believe Sony wanted a game similar to that." Sony approached From Software due to their history of creating the King's Field games, envisioning the development of a new version of King's Field to rival the Elder Scrolls series. Spearheading this initiative from Sony's side was Takeshi Kaji, the producer of Demon's Souls. In an interview, he said, "I've always loved From Software's games, such as King's Field and Armored Core. When I had the opportunity to talk with From Software about Kingsfield, I said something along the lines of, "Are you not planning to develop the latest Kingsfield game?" Then I suggested, "Why don't we make it together?" It's worth noting that during these discussions, Miyazaki was occupied as the director for Armored Core for Answer. Therefore, he was not the director when Sony and From Software agreed to collaborate on the new game. The result of this collaboration is what we now know as Demon's Souls. The two companies had reached an agreement to develop a game that could rival the latest Elder Scrolls entry. However, right from the prototyping stage, the development team encountered numerous difficulties, and these issues were so severe that there was a looming possibility of canceling the project altogether. The original director and his team were doing their best to replicate the essence of Oblivion in their project. It was during this critical phase that Miyazaki came into the picture. In a previous video, we covered Miyazaki's remarkable journey of entering the game industry despite having no prior experience or training. Moreover, at the age of 30, he was considered relatively old to embark on a new career in Japan. Nonetheless, he persisted and quickly rose to become a game director after completing just one project at From Software. While working as the director for Armored Core for Answer, he learned about this other project in From Software that was struggling and beset with various issues. It was considered a failed project, but it interested him, and that's because it is a fantasy game, his favorite genre. Miyazaki said, "I'd worked exclusively on Armored Core titles in my role at From Software, but I'd always wanted to make a dark fantasy game that drew on the fighting fantasy series of books. The Demon's Souls project was that opening that I'd always been waiting for." With 3 projects under his belt, 2 of them as a director, Miyazaki seized the opportunity without hesitation. He didn't mind if the project was struggling. What mattered most to him was the chance to direct it and shape it according to his own vision. Reflecting on this, Miyazaki shared, "Demon's Souls was not doing well. The project had issues, and the team had been unable to create a compelling prototype. But when I learned that it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was thrilled. I realized that if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could shape it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas ever failed, nobody would care because it was already considered a failure." Consequently, the original director was replaced, and despite already being occupied as the director of the Armored Core game, Miyazaki assumed the directorial position for Demon's Souls. Remarkably, this would not be the last time he would simultaneously direct 2 games. In fact, it would become a trend for all the Souls games he would go on to create. Miyazaki said, "When Demon's Souls was in the early stages of planning and about to enter the prototyping phase, I joined as the director. At that time, it was a completely different and challenging project compared to what it eventually became." After taking control of the project as the director, Miyazaki introduced significant changes to salvage the game and guide the development team in the right direction. The first major change he made was shifting away from the original goal of creating an Oblivion clone, which he clearly expressed through a modification in the game's camera perspective. Gradually, he began laying the foundation for what would later be recognized as a Souls game. Miyazaki explained, "One thing I recall was that the camera perspective was entirely different. At that time, the approach was to make it a first-person game, or more precisely, a game with the option to switch between first and third-person camera. However, personally, I didn't believe we could compete effectively by taking the same approach as Oblivion. So I wanted to shift the focus to gameplay elements like combat and exploration. I had to do a lot to convince everyone that a third-person perspective was the best way to go." By changing the camera perspective, Miyazaki could profoundly influence the game's direction and the aspects it needed to prioritize. Miyazaki shared, "I began by explaining the direction for the game, emphasizing the focus on combat and exploration. To facilitate those aspects, I firmly believed that a locked third-person perspective was the best choice, and I elaborated on my reasoning. Whether it was considering the environment design, object and enemy placement, or the fluidity of combat, I knew that fixing the camera perspective was essential for achieving our best results. Even when considering multiplayer elements and other gameplay aspects, I was convinced that a third-person perspective would be most effective. I shared all these thoughts and ideas that came to my mind to convince the team." Not only did Miyazaki steer the game away from being an Oblivion clone, but he also deliberately distanced it from King's Field, aiming to create a game that was uniquely his own. Miyazaki explained, King's Field was the starting point of the Demon's Souls project. However, if you're asking whether Demon's Souls is a successor to King's Field, the answer is no. We were well aware that we wanted to create an entirely new title with Demon's Souls. More importantly, Miyazaki bestowed the game and its development team with a unified vision that captured the essence of Demon's Souls. In Miyazaki's own words, he expressed, "The first thing I considered when developing this game was to recreate the classic RPG experience using modern technology. As I mentioned earlier, my goal is to convey the same sense of enjoyment and fulfillment we experienced in the old games, such as the thrill of discovery, the joy of critical thinking, and a profound sense of accomplishment on the latest platform, the PlayStation 3. Speaking about Demon's Souls, he revealed, I want players to be abruptly thrown into an unfamiliar realm and experience the sensation of asking themselves, now, what should I do? This kind of feeling pervaded all my beloved old games, an atmosphere of I'm going to do this, but is it okay? He further illustrated, for instance, imagine getting a ship in an RPG game and feeling that sense of, hey, I can go anywhere now. Yet, in the excitement, one ventures to an uncharted island and meets their demise. I yearned for that kind of adventurous spirit. Once Miyazaki had determined and expressed the core essence of Demon's Souls, he inadvertently gave birth to the concept of the Souls game. The moment Miyazaki used the words challenge, difficulty, and accomplishment in the same sentence, he established a winning template for all his future games. Miyazaki explained, making the game difficult was never the goal. What we primarily aimed for is to provide a sense of accomplishment in overcoming the challenges faced in difficulties. We understood that having high difficulty is just one way to provide an intense feeling of accomplishment through preparing strategies, overcoming obstacles, and discovering new things. Our goal of providing a sense of accomplishment has been the foundation of the game since we started development, and it is something we never strayed from. Though Miyazaki repeatedly emphasized that difficulty was never the goal, it became the main attribute that Demon's Souls and the rest of the Souls games would become famous for. In an interview, he added, I think Demon's Souls is a really difficult game. However, I designed the game so that even I, who am not good at action games, can clear it. I want players to think and strategize. The more it tests your resolve, the more satisfying the triumph. For Miyazaki's Demon's Souls, death took on a new meaning. It became a crucial means for players to learn, adapt, and overcome the challenges presented in the game. This led to the exhilarating feeling familiar to most Souls players, the sense of accomplishment. Miyazaki further explained, I considered failure a necessary element to derive enjoyment from devising strategies and feeling a sense of achievement upon succeeding. The most obvious form of this was death, which became an integral part of Demon's Souls. However, as this was the first Souls game, an untested and unprecedented concept, there was a high risk that the frequent deaths in the game might be misinterpreted as overwhelmingly frustrating. In fact, Miyazaki and his team were very worried that they had made Demon's Souls so difficult that they intentionally concealed this aspect from Sony. Miyazaki revealed, honestly, we didn't really mention that aspect of the game during our presentations to Sony. We knew that the executives might perceive it negatively and demand changes, so during the product concept presentation I didn't talk about it much. Of course, I informed our producer at Sony, and he actually agreed with me. He thought that if we were too upfront about the game's death mechanics and new concept with the marketing people, they would have run a mile, so that's why we had to be a bit sneaky about it. When asked about the influences for Demon's Souls, Miyazaki explained, I never had a video game influence in mind when writing the design documents. Of course, people need to make comparisons, and our game has been likened to Diablo, Monster Hunter, and even Bushido Blade. But none quite fit. I think this is because our orientation for the game was so different. We weren't built around cutscenes or scenarios, as in so many action RPGs. Rather, our aim was to have the player feel rewarded simply by playing the game. Not for completing a quest or finding a prize or winning loot, but simply by playing and experiencing the game. We wanted to steer clear of current trends. We thought it would only be judged by a handful of core players. Without meaning to attribute special significance to the game, now that there are so few games of its type, We believed that there was definitely a need for it, and we also felt that it was something that the current games industry needed. With all these ideas in mind, we created Demon's Souls. These statements align with the information we have already learned in our previous video, where we discovered that Miyazaki's childhood was spent playing adventure game books instead of video games. It was only in college that he discovered the third-person perspective combat of Ocarina of Time and Ico's gameplay-driven narrative and flow. Miyazaki further added, "The worlds of the games we used to play, the ones that made us tremble with excitement, were all Western worlds, like in the series of fantasy game books. When we made Demon's Souls, we took a back-to-basics approach, and so it turned into that kind of world." Miyazaki stayed true to this statement, and excluding Sekiro, all of the settings of the Souls games have been Western cities, castles, and kingdoms, reminiscent of those found in Berserk and the adventure game books he read as a child. Now that Miyazaki had rallied the team and provided them with a unifying vision, it was time to proceed with the development of the main parts of the game. Let's now delve into the features that Miyazaki introduced, which have become a staple in all the Souls games. As discussed earlier, the very essence of a Souls game revolves around challenge and accomplishment. For most players, these aspects materialize in the form of difficulty. The more demanding the game, the greater the sense of achievement felt upon overcoming it. Miyazaki emphasized, "You need to experience the game to truly appreciate the approach. It may not boast the cutting-edge graphics seen in modern high-spec games, nor does it rely on massive combos with impressive special effects. Demon's Souls' most valuable asset is the experience itself, something that can only be truly appreciated through first-hand play." What we aimed to evoke in players was a profound sense of accomplishment when they achieved something in the game. If it weren't challenging, players wouldn't have ample opportunities to strategize and give their best efforts. I aspired to create a game where defeating a boss or achieving a significant milestone would evoke a triumphant response, with players exclaiming, "I did it," in exhilaration. To illustrate how Miyazaki and his Souls games have consistently upheld this sense of achievement, here's a perspective shared by Felix after he accomplished a zero-death run of Elden Ring.
I know now, from doing this, and you as well for watching, a ridiculous amount about a video game. It has absolutely no practical value whatsoever. I can't think of anything more meaningless. But I gotta say, at that moment when I hit that goal, it definitely meant something.
For anyone who has played a Souls game and experienced being blocked by a challenging boss, you can relate precisely to this feeling. Additionally, we have a short montage showcasing players displaying the exact triumphant response that Miyazaki envisioned when he first directed Demon's Souls over 15 years ago.
Souls for no hero! We did it!
Fuck you! Fuck you! Oh my god, screw you, you piece of shit! Yes! Yes! I'm... Look at that. We beat the hardest souls in Dark Souls.
Miyazaki emphasizes that death represents the ultimate form of failure in the game, but he firmly believes that each death presents an opportunity for learning. According to Miyazaki, if you think carefully, you can emerge victorious. I encourage you to approach the challenges step by step, allowing yourself to explore and succeed. It's not a game where you simply encounter frequent deaths, but rather an experience that constantly keeps you highly aware of your surroundings and continuously tests your knowledge of its contents and mechanics. In the game, armor and weapons aren't just for display. They hold intrinsic value and usefulness. We genuinely wanted players to concentrate on this aspect of the game, experiencing the satisfaction of overcoming challenges through informed decisions. However, reaching this point necessitates experiencing failures and learning from them. For a game to effectively utilize death as the primary method of teaching players, it must maintain a sense of fairness. Otherwise, it risks causing frustration. Miyazaki pointed out, the game's difficulty level is intentionally high, leading to frequent defeats. However, I strive to ensure that the cause of defeat is not primarily the game's fault. When players fail, it's crucial that it's due to their own actions. Otherwise, they might lose motivation to grow and improve. It wouldn't be reasonable for players to die because of flaws in the game's design or mechanics. Additionally, winning based on mere probability isn't desirable. I avoid creating situations where success is achieved merely by repeating actions over and over. Instead, players must confront the game, recognizing their mistakes when they fall. I believe this approach is distinct from simply experiencing defeat due to an unreasonable game design or being defeated by a critical hit. Striking this balance is crucial. It's a design choice that encourages players to persevere even in the face of failure without breaking their spirits. It's an essential aspect of the game. In essence, Miyazaki emphasizes that player failure should be a result of their own decisions and actions within the game's challenging environment, rather than unfair game mechanics or pure luck. This approach encourages players to persist, learn from their mistakes, and ultimately grow as they progress through the game. When the player perceives the game as fair, it becomes inevitable for them to accept that their failure within the game is entirely their own responsibility. As Miyazaki expressed, it's not ideal if the player merely feels discomfort upon dying. When you face defeat, you must come to terms with it as your own fault. He aimed to guide players' thoughts towards the realization that any failures were attributed to their own inadequacies, saying, "For me, I wanted to lead the players' thoughts in the direction of, I was terrible because I was doing it badly." During an interview, the host inquired about Miyazaki's approach to creating the mythology of the game. Miyazaki explained, "We don't base our games on any specific works, nor do we begin by envisioning the game's world. Instead, I start by contemplating the game's mechanics and core concept, and then I select a worldview that complements that concept and build around it. In this regard, I find dark fantasy to be a theme that naturally aligns with my creative sensibilities and fits well with games." He chuckled and continued, "Having said that, it's a theme I genuinely love, so unless it contradicts the essence of the game, I find myself incorporating it in unique ways, almost like indulging my own hobby." The narration style of the Souls games becomes evident as early as Demon's Souls. The player is left to uncover the story on their own. Miyazaki explained his approach, stating, "I don't provide explicit explanations in the game because I believe that it compels players to dig deeper, and the essence of this game lies in the thrill of unraveling the mysteries for yourself. A world where every rule is laid bare can be mundane, so I crafted a world that feels enigmatic. I want you to exercise your imagination and interpret it to some extent." Kaji further elaborated on their intentions, saying, "Our approach was to deliberately avoid a pre-established narrative. There isn't a predefined story unfolding before you. Instead, the experience centers around you and the choices you make step by step. In a way, I feel it brings back the essence of early video games where you feel apprehensive at every turn. You sense that death and failure loom constantly, but that's balanced by the immense joy when you triumph over a challenge. These deeply human emotions are what we aim to explore in Demon's Souls, and that's where the true enjoyment lies." Demon's Souls, and the subsequent 5 Souls games that followed it, do not include a map functionality. This omission might be unusual and frustrating for players who are accustomed to having maps in other games. Miyazaki explained, "I intended for players to discover and memorize the map on their own. Even if it's initially an unfamiliar place, it gradually becomes familiar as you explore it. That sense of familiarity is truly valuable. In a sense, it's reminiscent of older games. When you grapple with the absence of a map, the surroundings become ingrained in your mind. Repeatedly venturing into the dungeon etches the pathways in your memory. I believe that feeling is a source of great accomplishment." One of the new mechanics of the game is that the player loses their souls, the main currency of the game, if they die twice before reaching their bloodstain. While this feature has been a source of frustration for many players, Miyazaki firmly believes that it significantly contributes to the game's integrity. As Miyazaki explained, The nature of the bloodstain was a topic of extensive discussion during the game's development. We were aware of the frustration players might experience, but we ultimately settled on this mechanic because if dropped souls could be regained at any time, it would diminish the suspense and the sense of accomplishment. We want players to feel the weight of their actions, thinking, I can't die until I retrieve all those souls back. Or I did it, I made it to my bloodstain. This aspect ties back to the concept of embracing failure that I mentioned earlier. The risk of losing a substantial number of souls upon death was deemed necessary to magnify the sense of achievement players feel when they succeed in recovering them later on. In Demon's Souls, all game levels are static, meaning they remain unchanged no matter how many times you play them. This static nature is crucial for a game that emphasizes learning through death. Despite players perceiving certain levels as unfair, the static design eliminates surprise elements and perceived unfairness. Subsequent deaths are then seen as the player's responsibility. Miyazaki explained, "My aim was to create a system that turns learning into a rewarding experience. For instance, the placement of enemies remains fixed, a deliberate game design choice that considers the satisfaction of dying and subsequently remembering. In other words, even if a player dies and loses all their souls, they can still learn the enemy placements and overcome the challenge once more." In addition to their fixed and static nature, the levels in the game incorporate a sense of warning for the players through visual cues or sound. For instance, if you can hear a monster grunting, it is highly likely that it is hidden and waiting to pounce as soon as you approach it. Miyazaki explained, "In the game, there will be hints in certain areas where players are more likely to face death. I attempted to design the map in a way that would subtly indicate something suspicious. Additionally, the use of blood marks and messages can assist players in avoiding sudden traps and unexpected deaths." Demon's Souls is renowned for its difficulty, primarily attributed to its challenging boss fights. It is not uncommon for players to dedicate several nights to combat the same boss and repeatedly hit a wall. However, these boss battles are a true delight, rewarding players with an unparalleled sense of achievement. Miyazaki expressed, "When designing the bosses, I ensured they were diverse and thrilling. I crafted various gameplay mechanics and strategies for each one, preventing players from becoming fatigued with repetitive encounters. Our aim was to surprise players, motivating them to adopt different tactics and think on their feet. Each boss embodies a simple yet distinctive concept. For instance, the man-eater can be summed up as, 'There's another enemy.'" When inquired about his favorite boss in Demon's Souls, Miyazaki shared, "Speaking of bosses, it's probably the old monk. This boss employs a unique system where the player faces other players. At that time, such a system wasn't common, and I received a few complaints and warnings, but in the end, players appreciated it greatly, as it offered a refreshing experience. So, it's the one that has stayed with me the most." According to Miyazaki, most modern games heavily focus on multiplayer, but he does not prefer creating games where players simply meet up in-game and rush through the story and challenges. Miyazaki explained, "I found that existing online games involve a high communication load, and that creates a barrier that I can't enjoy. To put it simply, it's a troublesome scenario. I conveyed to Sony, if the online play so far is like a phone call, what we want to do is more akin to email. Communicating by email involves less immediacy compared to direct speech. That was my aim. Firstly, I wanted to eliminate the need for instantaneous communication, and secondly, I wanted to do away with the physicality of it, meaning the requirement for voice communication. The combination of these two concepts gave rise to the unique asynchronous online mode present in Demon's Souls. As an embodiment of the low communication load concept, Demon's Souls features a messaging system that stands out among video games. This system enables players to leave each other clues and hints by posting in-game information within the environment. Miyazaki elaborated, "The idea behind the message system was rooted in a time when we had less information readily available. During that era, players had to collaborate and support one another to progress through games. The intention behind this messaging system was to foster a sense of unity among players." Demon's Souls introduced a unique feature where a player's death would leave a bloodstain visible to others who were online. Miyazaki expressed his delight in this mechanic. He explained, "Regarding the bloodstains and messages, I believe the system worked nearly as expected. Even when I play Demon's Souls at home, If I come across bloodstains in a particular area, it brings me joy, and I can't resist watching the last moments of the player. This feature was intended to enhance the sense of adventure, and the game balance itself was also designed with consideration for the bloodstains and messages. It might be slightly misleading to say it's unfair, but some of the sudden traps and similar challenges are intentionally crafted to evoke appreciation for the presence of bloodstains and messages. I aimed to create a feeling like, oh, if it weren't for the bloodstains, I would have fallen victim to this trap. Playing a Souls game online offers an incredible experience, particularly when you encounter invasions. Miyazaki believes that it adds significantly to the role-playing aspect of the game, as players must either pursue or evade the invader who seeks to eliminate their character. Miyazaki explained, "My vision was for players to embody each other's adversaries. I felt that the game would be most engaging if, at times, a clever enemy turned out to be another player. As for the decision to begin by searching for each other, I wanted to promote strategic combat utilizing the entire map. Hence, this aspect was intentionally incorporated into the game." Demon's Souls features an online option that allows players to summon others for cooperative gameplay. This proves particularly valuable when a daunting boss enemy impedes your progress. While this feature remains optional, certain players require all the help they can muster to conquer these formidable foes that act as barriers on their journey. However, this collaboration is transitory and endures only until the boss enemy is defeated. In an interview, Miyazaki said, "Given that Demon's Souls is a game characterized by numerous instances of player death, it is reasonable to expect that this ephemeral sense of cooperation would arise from the midst of all the fatalities. The concept essentially becomes, since we are all experiencing defeat, why not extend a helping hand to one another?" When queried about the origin of this transient cooperation, Miyazaki shared an intriguing anecdote. He recounted, "The origin of that idea is actually due to a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone can get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't halt the car to express gratitude to the people who gave me a nudge. I would have become stuck again if I had paused. On the journey back home, I wondered whether the last person in the line had reached home, and pondered that I would probably never encounter the people who had assisted me. I speculated that perhaps if we had met elsewhere, we would have become friends, or perhaps we would have quarreled. You could perhaps label it as a connection of mutual assistance between transient individuals. Strangely, that incident will likely linger in my heart for a considerable time. Simply because it's fleeting, I believe it remains with you much longer, much like the cherry blossoms we Japanese cherish so dearly. Demon's Souls is the first game in the Souls series to introduce the unique feature where a player can assume the role of a boss. This concept would not be revisited until Dark Souls 3. Miyazaki expressed, "Implementing this feature was quite challenging, but I'm pleased that we managed to include it in the game. There's a certain thrill in being unexpectedly called to become a boss, and at first, you're unsure of what's happening. Suddenly, you find yourself summoned to an unfamiliar location, donning a peculiar headpiece. This particular feature is also why the old monk remains one of my favorite bosses." Miyazaki emphasizes that Demon's Souls is fundamentally a single-player game, and any online features they introduce are intended to enrich the single-player experience. He explained, "If anything, our primary goal was to utilize the network as a tool to make single-player RPGs more captivating, and to provide various stimuli to the solo gaming experience. The enjoyment that Demon's Souls aims to deliver is rooted in the essence of a single-player RPG. It is considered one of the elements that emerged from the networking plan, intended to facilitate both cooperative and hostile play." Now that we have covered the major features of Demon's Souls, let's continue the story of its creation. The game had been developed, and the team was gearing up for its first public reveal. Unlike the later Souls games, Demon's Souls' official public unveiling and gameplay reveal took place simultaneously. In the future, these events would be separate, usually with several months in between. The following screen displays the timeline for various Souls games. Miyazaki and the team had high expectations for the reveal of Demon's Souls at the Tokyo Game Show. It's only natural for any game development team to be excited about sharing their hard-worked game with fans for the first time. However, the result was not as expected. It turned out to be a disaster. The game looked familiar to the players, but its behavior was different from what they had anticipated. The controls and combat mechanics were deliberate and methodical, and the difficulty level was unforgiving. Players coming from other action RPGs found Demon's Souls to be clunky. To understand what happened at the Tokyo Game Show in 2008, let's take a look at some of the other games that appeared alongside it. Compared to these games, Demon's Souls would undoubtedly feel slow and clunky. Remember, the term Souls game didn't hold any meaning to anyone at that time. In an interview, Takeshi Kaji shared his experience at the Tokyo Game Show. He stated, "When we first demoed Demon's Souls at the Tokyo Game Show, it was nothing short of a disaster. Players were initially excited about the concept of a dark fantasy game, but they were highly critical of the gameplay. Many people assumed we were still iterating on the combat at that stage of development, despite it being nearly finished. The truth is that Demon's Souls is not well suited for previews, particularly at shows. You can't possibly understand its approach in 5 minutes." Due to its action RPG style, people simply expected it to handle in the same way as Sengoku Musou. When it didn't, they were left disoriented. This perception was aggravated by the fact that the controls aren't based on any familiar scheme. Only a handful of players managed to finish the demo. Some even put the controller down at the character creation screen, which was particularly disheartening. Back at the headquarters, Miyazaki and the development team were filled with worry. Were they wrong in the approach they had taken for Demon's Souls? Would Sony demand them to change the game? Miyazaki said, "We were certain that we had gone too far with this. The team kept waiting for Sony to instruct us to rethink our approach, but that directive never came." Kaji added, "Here at Sony, our goal is to deliver games that resonate with the broadest possible audience, so a critical decision had to be made. Should we ask From Software to make the game more accessible, or should we let them follow the creative path they had set for this project? Ultimately, we chose the latter, and fortunately, it turned out to be the right decision. But let's be honest, the decision wasn't entirely selfless. In truth, we were able to grant the project such creative freedom thanks to fortuitous timing and well-aligned release schedules. In that context, we were fortunate. This isn't the kind of title that companies can generally afford to create without a perfect alignment of the right timing, skilled individuals, and management's willingness to take risks." Miyazaki and his team continued with the development of the game without altering any of its features, and finally, the release day for Japan arrived. As expected by now, the game did not fare well. It underperformed and failed to meet Sony's financial expectations. It only managed to sell around 20,000 copies, which was far less than what Sony had hoped for. Kaji shared, "Initially, sales were poor. We sold between 20 to 30,000 copies in Japan in the first week, and since the first feedback we received during development from the Tokyo Game Show was not favorable, we were deeply disappointed and worried that the project might fail. As developers, we immediately began contemplating whether different features could have made a difference. It was a tough time." Miyazaki, understandably, felt disheartened. Demon's Souls was the kind of game he wanted to create the most. If there was a game he was eager to succeed, it was Demon's Souls. Miyazaki said, "During the period just after completing development, the evaluation and sales forecast within From Software were not promising, so I couldn't even imagine being given another chance to develop a similar game again." Even the president of Sony Interactive believed that the game was terrible. He disliked it so much that he wouldn't allow it to be published by Sony outside of Japan. He was convinced that it would be a failure and wouldn't generate any profit. Shuhei Yoshida, the president of Sony Interactive in 2008, said, "In my personal experience playing Demon's Souls, when it was almost final, I spent around 2 hours playing it. And even after all that time, I was still stuck at the beginning of the game. I told myself, this is crap. This is an unbelievably bad game. So I stopped and put it aside. We underestimated the quality of Demon's Souls, and to be honest, the media in Japan did the same. We definitely dropped the ball from a publisher's perspective, including the studio management side. We failed to grasp the value of the product we were making." However, like the phoenix, Demon's Souls would ascend. And it all happened because of a small group of Western video game players, streamers, and YouTubers. Even though the game was initially released exclusively in Japan, a few players and streamers imported it, and Demon's Souls began to garner a reputation in the Western gaming community for its punishing difficulty, eventually gaining a cult following. Reviews started pouring in, and the general reception was overwhelmingly positive. Critics loved it for what it was, a demanding game designed for serious players. As word of mouth spread, more and more players became curious and eager to experience the game for themselves. This grassroots enthusiasm led to a growing demand for an official release of Demon's Souls in the West. Recognizing the potential, Atlus and Bandai Namco seized the opportunity, and with that, the sales of Demon's Souls exploded. Miyazaki said, "The contrast between how we felt around the time of the initial release and when the game broke, the 100,000 sales mark was gigantic. Above all, I was relieved to feel that the players accepted the game's sense of accomplishment, which was our aim." When asked about the factors that contributed to the game's success, Miyazaki replied, "This is a difficult question, as we can't fully analyze the result perfectly. However, one thing I can possibly say is that this game was designed and created to directly focus on the core essence that lies within game lovers that are common all around the world, rather than trying to cater specifically to gamer preferences based on different markets like Japan, US, Europe, or Asia. Creating a game aimed at this sincere element in gamers was one of the policies I made efforts to maintain throughout the development process. If I may dare to say, I believe that in Demon's Souls, the gameplay was built on values shared by so-called game lovers from both the East and the West. It's a very simple and primitive gameplay, reminiscent of classic games like Wizardry. As a result, the game is less dependent on cultural nuances, and I believe it was equally well received in Japan and overseas. With the success of Demon's Souls, fans were left wondering if there would be a sequel, or perhaps a spiritual successor, in case Sony was not interested in a second collaboration. Miyazaki replied, "As an employee of the development company, I can't directly confirm whether there will be a sequel to Demon's Souls. However, from a personal standpoint, I believe we learned many valuable lessons during the creation of Demon's Souls, and there were numerous aspects we couldn't explore fully the first time. Given the chance, I would wholeheartedly welcome the opportunity to create an even better game in a similar style. If the opportunity arises, I believe we could deliver something truly special."